Hold on tight for the next hour. You're entering into a place, a zone called the alternative to the alternative media. It's a place, a special place where even truth seekers fear to tread.
All right, people, let's move like we've got a purpose.
Affirmative.
Okay, hey, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, people of all races, colors, and creeds. If you have the coronavirus or you don't, you still can listen to the show. And how are you going to know you're going to get it if you don't get tested? Maybe that's the reason for all of this stuff. You come down with a common cold, and you're going to have to go in and get your coronavirus test. Well, anyway, Greg Anthony here on the Investigative Journal. Greatest show on earth because we delve into things that the mainstream and alternative media fail to do. And today's show is all about socialism. Yes, we're going to get to the mystery novel that I'm writing about the coronavirus, or I call it the Wuhan virus, tomorrow, as well as our continuing show on this fake war on drugs. Anytime the federal government puts the tag war on something, it always gets worse. So let's talk about socialism. And the reason I want to do this, of course, is because that's all you hear. Go to conservative Fox. You'll hear it 100 times every day. They're, in fact, doing a special on the history of socialism and communism. And, of course, on CNN, you're going to hear it all the time. So I thought we'd chime in with something they're leaving out. They don't seem to understand the Vatican Jesuit connection to socialism. And so we've provided that on this show many, many times. And apparently they don't listen, don't want to talk about it. And instead of going back first to the 1600s and talk about the Jesuit Paraguay reductions when they were experimenting and devised socialism that was carried through the centuries into places like, you know, where it's been, and even to today in America. And that just started, I'm telling you, in the mainstream just recently. So I thought we'd chime in and, bring together the missing parts that they fail to talk about. Okay? So where do we start? I guess we could start a little bit with Bernie Sanders. And remember this, Bernie's a proclaimed socialist. He has a big, huge following in the Socialist Democratic Party that is supposedly fighting against the moderates in the Democratic Party. But let's start out with Bernie in 2009 was talking about things much differently. He didn't seem to be a socialist then. He wanted to close the borders. He seemed to be a pretty moderate. All of a sudden he changed. And let's talk about the connections a little bit. We don't ever talk about the Vatican, Pope Francis, and others and their socialist ways. So let's start there. And then we'll move in a little bit to Bernie Sanders. We'll talk about Ocasio-Cortez and her entrance into the political scene. And I have a really great video presentation by someone who talks about where she really came from. And we've discussed it on this show. I thought I'd play it because he did a good job with it. But anyway, let's start out with understanding that Pope Francis has been planting Marxists throughout the church, including at the top of the troubled religious order he belongs to. Remember, the Jesuits, with the blessing of Pope Francis, installed the Superior General in 2016. He was a Venezuelan named Father Arturo Sosa. Now, his communist convictions have long been known, and is it any coincidence what's happening to Venezuela? And so today I'm thinking about that, and then I turn on Fox, and there's Trump talking to the Colombian president, and they're talking about the problems with, they got to clean up Venezuela. Socialism sucks. Look what's happening. And the Colombian president was talking about how they had to get rid of Maduro, how they had to bring capitalism back to Venezuela as the people have no food. They're rushing to Colombia just to to buy food products, and basically they've turned the country into a disaster. So how could that be? How could there be such a push for socialism here when it's so obvious what it's doing there? Well, that is called the Hegelian dialectic. That is the reason Bernie Sanders is here, the reason Trump is extolling America first, because they have to push these two ideas together. Create chaos. One of them will win. In comes the coronavirus. Is that going to destroy the economy? Is that going to give Sanders and the socialists a bigger push towards getting their way and the Jesuits' way? And why would they want that anyway? Total control. Take your property, take your house, take everything from you, and supposedly let the government save you. That's basically control. Now, we're not going to get into how the coronavirus plays into this, but let's talk about what Pope Francis is doing, and the connection here between them and socialism. Now, Sosa's written about the Marxist mediation of the Christian faith, arguing that the church should understand the existence of Christians who simultaneously call themselves Marxists and commit themselves to the transformation of the capitalist society into a socialist society. In 1989, he signed a letter praising Fidel Castro. Turn down any corridor in Francis's Vatican, and you're likely to find another de facto communist. Francis is a communist running his order, a communist running his Council of Cardinals, the Honduran Cardinal Oscar Rodriguez Maradiaga, a communist running the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, Margaret Archer, a British sociologist who has said that she represents the Marxist view. And communists such as the renegade Brazilian liberation theologist Leonardo Boff and the Canadian socialist Naomi Klein drafting his encyclicals. It's no coincidence that the only U.S. presidential candidate who made a visit to the Vatican during the campaign, we're going back now to the last one, was a socialist who had honeymooned in the Soviet Union, and that's Bernie Sanders. He turned up in the Vatican in April 2016, having received an invitation from Pope Francis' close Argentinian friend, Bishop Marcelo Sanchez Sorando. And here's what they said. We invited the candidate who cites the Pope most in the campaign, and that is Senator Bernie Sanders, explained Sorando, who added that Sanders' agenda is very analogous to that of the Pope's. Now, does he give the Pope any credit? No. In this smug leftist atmosphere in Rome, Sosa, the Jesuit general's elevation to the head of the order was inevitable. In the past, Jesuits had been called the Pope's Marines. Under Sosa, they are more like the Pope's Marxists, peddling the climate change propaganda as a pretext, folks, for global socialism. Now, Bernie is going to tell you that this is called American socialism. Don't believe this. This is coming right from the Jesuit order, their long history of socialism, their long history of knowing how to foment it by using the Hegelian dialectic, by funding many, many radical groups that basically fight against capitalism. We may get into the second half hour on the Jesuit connection to ISIS. But Sosa's ambitions, that's the head of the Jesuit general, like Pope Francis, go well beyond meddling in economies. He's also pushing for this moral revolution in the church, evident in his astonishing claim that since none of the apostles tape-recorded Jesus Christ, his words on adultery can be reinterpreted. He said this, you need to start by reflecting on what exactly Jesus said, Sosa told an Italian interviewer in last February. I think this was a couple of years ago. At that time, Sosa's saying, no one had a tape recorder to capture the words of Christ. Good idea, Mr. Sosa. We didn't know that. What we know is that the words of Jesus have been contextualized. They expressed in a certain language, in a precise environment, and they addressed to someone specific. In other words, Sosa is confident that he understands Jesus' meaning better than the gospel writers like themselves. Like Francis, Sosa can't resist the mumbo-jumbo of this modernist biblical scholarship, which always manages to dovetail conveniently to socialism, liberal views, etc. Now, you remember the Council of Trent. It explicitly condemned the claim that gospel writers were just making stuff up when recounting the words of Jesus. But Sosa has no problem trafficking in that heresy. Over the last century, in the church, said Sosa, there has been a great blossoming of studies that seek to understand exactly what Jesus meant to say. The presumption here is extraordinary, but typical of these socialists in Francis's army. The new orthodoxy is that Sosa is wallowing in it. He's given to the sermonites on relativism, such as this one. He said this: "The church has developed over the centuries. It is not a piece of reinforced concrete. It was born, it was learned, it has changed. This is why the ecumenical councils are held, to try to bring developments of doctrine into focus. Doctrine is a word that I don't like very much. It brings with it the image of hardness of stone. Instead, the human reality is much more nuanced. It is never black and white. It is continual development." Now, if Ignatius Loyola were alive today, the order he founded wouldn't ordain him, and he would have wondered how a de facto Protestant ended up on the chair of St. Peter. Well, anyway, getting into this socialist connection, it's amazing, and that most of that was taken from, let me give credit here, this is from the American Spectator, appeared in a May 19th, 2017 article. But it goes even farther than that right now, and I'm trying to work my way backwards here so you get an idea. Usually when I start talking about socialism, I get pissed off because nobody wants to ever give the Jesuits credit for it, and I want to do that. I want to give them the credit they deserve. And that is when they created this idea and took over in Paraguay and really made a fortune off these, basically, let's call them slaves. They took the idea and just ran with it. Look at what they did. Look at how they connected with Lenin and Stalin. Look at how they even controlled the other side with the Nazis. It's an amazing story. They're just too much for words, and I'm so tired of them not getting credit where credit is due. So if you people out there like socialism, you millennials out there, all you Bernie Sanders people, please look into who your real founders are, your founding fathers of socialism, and give them some credit. Hold them up on a banner. Hold them up high so that we all can understand the beauty of this great order who only wants to help you, just like they helped the natives in Paraguay. Do you realize they were nothing but slaves and the Jesuits got rich? Look into that story. Look how they're helping you with Father Sosa in Argentina. He's the head of the Jesuits, a Venezuelan, and look at what he's doing to his country. But he's here to help you. And you know what? Look at the recent, and I talked about it before, but let's look at it again. There's a Jesuit magazine that's the most prominent in the world. It's called the American Magazine. And I told you how they're extolling the virtues of communism and how it coincides with Catholicism and how they're pushing this communist socialist agenda, even through their magazine, in an article that appeared last year. Now, I looked and I talked about this in another show, but I found a comment, an article written in Australia about this, and I thought I might read you part. And it said this: "In a dramatic abandonment of a century of staunch Catholic opposition to communism and socialism, the Jesuit Order's main magazine in the U.S. has published a 3,000-word article entitled 'The Catholic Case for Communism.' The article in the America Magazine, the Jesuit Review, the most renowned publication in the world, Jesuit publication, claims communism has provided one of the few sustainable oppositions to capitalism, a political order responsible for the ongoing suffering of millions," though they didn't mention that, It is that suffering reproduced by economic patterns that Marx and others try to explain, and not the secret plot of atheism that motivates communism. The article by the magazine's Canadian correspondent, PhD philosophy student Dean Detloff, conveniently ignores the impact of markets in lifting billions of people out of poverty across the developing world. Detloff praises Francis, a Jesuit, for a truly radical moment in his controversial Green Encyclical, when he wrote, quote, that the Christian tradition has never recognized the right to private property as absolute or inviolable, as your right, and has stressed the social purpose of all forms of private property. So listen, Pope Francis being the head of the new, Vatican-led New World Order, the minions being all of his people in control, whether they're on the left or the right, they're telling you right now they're going to take your property. He wants to take your property. It's not yours. Private property, he says, has never been recognized as an absolute right. Then why the hell do they have so much property? Ask him that. The Vatican owns a lot of property in this country, and they don't even pay taxes. Is it their right to have it? It's really amazing. And people listen to this crap, and this is what's going on. So now you hear about it every day on the news. You got Pope Francis in the Vatican extolling communism. You got all these young politicians coming in, shooting for socialism in America, pushing, trying to destroy anything about America. Now let's put it on the record here. Why are they frightened of it? Why do they want to erase the history of this country? If you take this country, the theory behind it, it's a beautiful theory. It's probably the best ever. It's only man that destroys it. And of course, there have been problems. But I can't think of a better system at this point. If you want to go to a socialist system like Venezuela, go right ahead. And that's what's happening here. And it could be just a year, it could be in November where it starts. That's how close you are. And that came on pretty quick, just like this coronavirus came on quick. And all of a sudden now, everybody doesn't want to shake hands. Everybody, it's an amazing story, isn't it? And I'm trying to check out exactly where we're at here. Okay, we got about 5 minutes. But Detloff says something like this is paralleled in the Communist Manifesto, when Marx and Engels underscore that abolishing private property means abolishing not personal property or the kinds of things an artisan or farmer might own, but the amassed property held by the rich, which divides human beings into antagonistic classes of people. All right, well, if the Vatican decides to get rid of all their property and give it to me, then I'll agree with them. All right? Now, priests, nuns, and laypeople, Detloff says, have been inspired by communists and in many places contributed to communist and communist-influenced movements as members. Some still do, he says, such in the Philippines, where activist groups are fighting the authoritarian right-wing President Rodrigo Duterte. Close to home and outside of armed struggles, Christians are also present today in communist movements in the United States and Canada. The article appears, this is just in 2019, with an infamous photograph of Francis accepting a hammer and sickle crucifix from Bolivian President Evo Morales when he visited Bolivia in 2015. 4 years ago, the gift sparked outrage among Catholics, especially in Eastern Europe, where millions of Christians were tortured and killed in Soviet persecutions. Spanning over a century, now communists, Christians, and non-Christians have fought against the violent capitalist economy, putting their lives and freedoms at risk, enduring character assassination, imprisonment, and war, Detloff says in this Jesuit magazine just last year. The loss of a mass communist movement, due in large part to the aggressive legal and political persecution by the U.S. and governments, has made organizing opposition to capitalism itself a difficult task. But even in its absence, a majority of millennials reject capitalism. That's what he's saying in his article. And you don't think the Jesuits are pushing this? Now, considering their history, if you know anything about it, obviously Fox News doesn't know anything about it because they've been presenting this history of socialism and this important fact of who created it, of their connections on the creators, the Jesuits, to Lenin, Marx, the rest of these people, to their connections to even Sosa in Venezuela now, seem to be. The controversial piece was accompanied by a commentary from the magazine's editor, Jesuit priest Father Matt Malone, entitled, "Why We Published an Essay Sympathetic to Communism." Why? The magazine's editorial position had on communism not changed much. What has also not changed is our willingness to hear views with which we may disagree. Here we go. The little Hegelian dialectic here. But we nonetheless think are worth hearing. On U.S. presidential candidate, Father Malone wrote, "Say he is a socialist, and several others don't mind sounding like one." All right. Jesuit magazine, that was just in 2019. All you hear on Fox News, on CNN, is this rise of socialism. You've got now Bernie Sanders in the lead with a socialist contingent of mostly millennials. Now, you've taken a poll, about, 50% of millennials want socialism? You even have many, many other people, millions of people, who will vote for Sanders and a socialist agenda. But do you realize where it's coming from? Do you realize if you do some history lessons, whatever they promise you, they can promise you everything, but we're in the end going to get nothing. Listen, capitalism, of course, has its problems. But you know something? Under this socialist view, under the Jesuits, in the Paraguay experiments, under their regimes in Russia, wherever they go, Venezuela, you just look at what happened, and you think it's going to be any different here? You're seeing the beginning of it in America, the beginning of a big change. I'm just trying to point out where this change is really coming from and how dangerous it really is. Now, let me set up something here for the second half hour, because we're kind of working our way backwards, right? And outside of Bernie Sanders, remember in 2016, you didn't hear much about socialism in your Congress. You didn't hear about it much on the news. But why has it changed dramatically since the advent of a few of these rookie Congress people getting elected, i.e., Ocasio-Cortez? And her push towards socialism, she's backing Bernie Sanders. And I thought it'd be interesting, and I've talked about it before, to really look at where she came from. Again, there's a connection here between the Jesuits, they're called the Justice Democrats, these young guys running the Justice Democrats, as well as the Young Turks, who are basically, for years now, have been looking for Democratic congressional districts where they can take out a moderate and put in one of their puppets like Ocasio-Cortez, give her what to say, and push this new radical socialist progressive agenda. So their goal is not just one district, but it's basically to take over the Democratic Party, which they're doing a pretty good job. Now, you might say that Nancy Pelosi and these old Democrats are against it. No, on the surface they are, but behind the scenes, their puppet masters, their Jesuit puppet masters, are using them, and they know it, as a foil. They have to argue it back and forth. Again, the Hegelian dialectic. But in the second half hour, I want to play this video that this guy did about Ocasio-Cortez's rise to power. And I've talked about it before, but he does a great job in explaining it, so I thought I'd play it. So come back to the Investigative Journal, back in 3 minutes on the Investigative Journal.
The book of Revelation says, "The spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ." This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today, so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org. When it comes to prophecy today, much of the evangelical Christian world has their eyes on Israel, waiting and watching to see when the third temple will begin to be built. The plans are drawn. The Jewish people are eager. Most evangelical Christians today believe that the rapture will happen before the third temple is built. Hi, I'm Michael Eugene. I was taught that Daniel's 70th week was in the future. Is that really what the Bible teaches? Have we searched the scriptures and found this to be true? Why is it so important for a re-established Israel to build a third temple in Jerusalem? Is it necessary to build a temple on the same location already occupied by the Dome of the Rock? Is it necessary for sacrifices to take place in the temple on Temple Mount? Is there really a rapture followed by 7 years of tribulation? What is the New Testament temple? Can we identify history and prophecy? Who is the first beast in Revelation chapter 13? Who are the 7 kings in Revelation 17? I have asked all these questions, and I have found Nicholas Arthur's new book, When the Third Temple is Built, answers all these questions and more using Scripture to interpret Scripture. The Bible says that no prophecy of Scripture is of any private interpretation. Nicholas shows us in his new book, When the Third Temple is Built, how the Bible interprets prophecy and not man's private interpretation. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org.
The following program is labeled dangerous and off limits by the supreme Jesuit command. But stand tall, people. Listen up, and you may just learn something.
Oh, dear Lord Jesus, this ain't happening, man. This can't be happening, man. This isn't happening.
Okay, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, people of all races, colors, and creeds, like I said, you're welcome to listen to the greatest show on earth, the Investigative Journal. Okay, in this half hour, I want to talk about the rise of superstar Alessandria Ocasio-Cortez. And basically, was she some brainchild, some genius who went to high school and all she could do was read about Marx, Engels, the socialist? She was such a great, gifted student that she could recite by heart the Constitution of the United States. Was she the type of person that could read to you the Declaration of Independence at the age of 4? Was she the type of person that could rattle off every state in the Union as well as its capital of Canada, too, by the time she was 2? Was she a prodigy? Was she destined to be this leader of Congress, leading us into this new America? Was she destined? Was she doing these studies as a young child of how evil the American system was by the time she was 5 years old, and understood the evils of capitalism by the time she was 6, and wrote a huge financial report that explained to you in depth how capitalism sucks the lifeblood out of people? Was she the one who actually is going to write the new Communist Socialist Manifesto in the United States? Or was Ocasio-Cortez just a bartender from the Bronx with a kind of appealing voice, a lot of energy, and just happened to win the audition that was set out, just like at a Hollywood movie, for the Congresswoman from the Bronx? Is it true that she really didn't understand how many branches of government there were and how they operated? Could she be so led by the nose by the Jesuits and their boys and the Young Turks and the Socialist Democrats, or what do they call them, the Justice Democrats, to trumpet in their view of socialism so they could do this in all districts and Democratic districts in the future? What is their goal? And was she just a puppet? And is she just a puppet? That's what we're going to talk about. And in the past, you make up your mind. But I did find this 22-minute, I'm going to play most of it so you won't have to listen to me anymore in this half hour, but it's well worth it because at this point, we're kind of working our way back on socialism. The points I was trying to make: one, why didn't Fox News tell you about the Jesuits and socialism? Why is the American magazine, the biggest Jesuit magazine in the country, espousing the beauties of communism and socialism? Why is Pope Francis the way he is and appointing all of these communists and socialists all over the place, including the new Jesuit general from Venezuela? And are they connected to this movement? Of course they are. So let's listen now at this point. We talked about Bernie Sanders' connections and what he's all about, and he knows that he's basically in cahoots with the Jesuits and the Vatican. And then let's look at this movement in Congress now. And where did Ocasio-Cortez come from? So let's play this video called The Brains Behind OAC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Okay, like I said, let's play the brains behind OAC.
The brains behind Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Mr. Reagan.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is not really the Congresswoman of New York's 14th Congressional District. She is essentially an actress. She's merely playing the part of a New York Congresswoman. I know this sounds crazy, but bear with me. In 2017, a group called the Justice Democrats held auditions for potential congressional candidates that they would run on their platform for various congressional seats throughout the country. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's brother Gabriel submitted her for the role. Now, I've auditioned for many acting roles in my day. I've also cast many of my own projects. I know how this works. If you find somebody with star power, even if they don't 100% fit the part, you go with it. Obviously, AOC has star power. Just look at her. She's a superstar, the most famous person in Congress, maybe ever. Their casting was perfect. Now, I didn't have to go digging for evidence for this because they freely admit it. They brag about it.
Back in 2016, we put out a call for nominations. We got over 10,000 nominations. Out of those 10,000 nominations, we found Alexandria.
My brother told me that he had sent my nomination in the summer, but I was like literally working out of a restaurant, and I was like, there's no way.
A casting call. They had a casting call. They cast Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the role of Congresswoman. And they did this so they could promote their own agenda. In this video, I'm going to make 3 very serious accusations against Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. 1, she did not actually run for Congress. 2, she is a puppet Congresswoman. And 3, the people controlling her are very dangerous. The first point I have already made. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did not run. She was run. What I mean by that is Alexandria did not take it upon herself to run for Congress. She was used by this group, the Justice Democrats, as a figurehead through which they could gain control of New York's 14th Congressional District House seat. These guys not only scripted and produced AOC's beautiful campaign video, but they organized the entire grassroots campaign effort. They handled all the fundraising, the social media, the get out the vote effort. They turned Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez into a brand, and they used that brand to take control of that House seat. The people of New York did not elect a Puerto Rican girl from Brooklyn to represent them. They elected an Indian guy from Texas and a white guy from Tennessee. Now, let's move on to my second accusation. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a puppet Congresswoman. AOC does not make her own policy decisions. She does not decide which way she votes on legislation. She defers completely to her team. This is a serious claim, I know, but consider the following evidence. This is a video of Corbin Trent, one of Alexandria's top advisors, speaking with Zach Alexi, the Saul Alinsky-style strategy expert who organized much of AOC's campaign. Corbin Trent is now Alexandria's top congressional aide.
And what's the stat that we were looking at earlier about
how much people are making?
Yeah, about low-income people and how big of a percent of our society that is now.
40%. Well, people that make $19,999 a year or less. So people that make $20,000 a year or less make up right around 40% of Americans, right? So it's
40% of Americans make less than $20,000.
Yeah. It's like 60 million people make less than $20,000 a year.
200 million Americans make less than $20,000 a year. That's 40% of this country.
40% of Americans make less than $20,000.
That's 40% of this country.
These guys are coaching her. They're scripting everything she says. You notice when she goes off script because she suddenly starts babbling incomprehensibly. The girl in this next clip is now the head of the Justice Democrats. Her name, Alexandra Rojas.
Really, I think a big anchor piece is the Green New Deal and talking about it in a frame of social, racial, and economic justice and a mobilization of our economy and our society at the scale of what we did during World War II.
The Green New Deal, how's that going to be different?
I think what we're calling for is a mobilization of our economy, of our society on the scale that we haven't seen since World War II.
Like, this is the war, this is our World War II.
It's clear that AOC is being coached on absolutely every policy point she makes. And if this is not enough to give you pause, consider that the Green New Deal was drafted in one weekend by her staff. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had zero to do with it. As far as I could find, she wasn't even in the room. Now, this is AOC's landmark legislation proposal. It essentially sums up her entire platform and lays out everything she wants to do in Congress. She didn't even participate in the drafting of the legislation. And again, these people aren't even trying to cover this up. They're proud of it. Again, AOC is a figurehead, a mouthpiece. The congressional seat is being operated behind the scenes. Old interviews show that the Justice Democrats initially declared that they wanted candidates of substance. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was a bartender. Now, who is more useful to an evil organization trying to take over Congress? A principled politician who happens to align with their views, or a pawn, a malleable innocent who they can manipulate, somebody completely ignorant of politics who must rely wholly on them to direct all her political positions, statements, and votes. AOC has had enough embarrassing gaffes to know that if she goes off script, it hurts. It can humiliate her. So she has become absolutely dependent on the instruction of her handlers. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez seems like, to anyone unfamiliar with her arrangement, like a bit of an enigma. Most of the time she seems to bumble along with no apparent idea about what she's doing. But sometimes she says and does things that seem kind of brilliant.
Let's play a lightning round game. I'm going to be the bad guy, which I'm sure half the room would agree with anyway. And I want to get away with as much bad things as possible, ideally to enrich myself and advance my interest, even if that means putting my interests ahead of the American people. The limits that are placed on me as a congresswoman, compared to the executive branch and compared to, say, the President of the United States, would you say that Congress has the same sort of standard of accountability?
In terms of laws that apply to the president, yeah, there's just almost no laws at all that apply to the president.
So I'm being held, and every person in this body is being held to a higher ethical standard than the President of the United States.
That's right, because there are some ethics committee rules that apply to you.
And it's already super legal, as we've seen, for me to be a pretty bad guy. So it's even easier for the President of the United States to be one, I would assume.
That's right.
Thank you very much.
This is initially what got me thinking. Who's pulling the strings here? Who's the man behind the curtain? I went to CPAC last week, as some of you know, in Washington, D.C., and I met a lot of people in politics. Occasionally, somebody would bring up AOC. I always took this opportunity to ask one question. Who's really running the show? Who's the brains behind Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? One guy had an answer. He grabbed his phone, he pulled up a Politico article, and he shoved it into my hand. That's who, he said. The man behind the curtain is this guy, Saikat Chakrabarti. Saikat was AOC's campaign manager and is now her chief of staff. Saikat came out of Harvard and worked as an organizer for the Bernie Sanders campaign. This guy doesn't really have the charisma to run for office himself. He's a little awkward. He might have Asperger's or something like that. He kind of reminds me of Daniel Radcliffe, actually. But don't let his disarming awkwardness fool you. He's been an extremely effective political operative. He's got some terrifying political influences, and he's suspected of committing some severe campaign finance violations. But we'll get into all that later. Saikat Chakrabarti is a sinister character, and hearing more about him later will give you chills. But the man who hired him to head up the Justice Democrats will horrify you, if you can even believe it. The mastermind behind it all, Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks. Now, this may all sound completely nuts, like a big conspiracy theory, but the Justice Democrats was heavily promoted on the Young Turks. We have video evidence from the inception through into the campaigns.
I think they have maxed out on incompetence. So that is why we must choose a new path. And that is what we embark upon today. What we need to do is take over the Democratic Party. And as Martin Luther King said when he did the Civil Rights Movement, he said he was doing it not just to help African Americans, but to save the soul of America. Here we're going to try to save the soul of the Democratic Party by boarding the Democratic Party ship and taking it over. How are we going to do that? We're going to run strong progressives. From now on, there will be a new wing of the Democratic Party, and it will be the Justice Democrats. We will seek social justice, economic justice, racial justice, and plain old justice.
Now, you might think, if Cenk wanted influence in government, why didn't he just run? If Saikat Chakrabarti wanted influence in government, despite his awkwardness, why didn't he run? Why put up AOC? The goals of this group are far grander and far more sinister than simply electing a single congresswoman to office. The goals are to take over the Democratic Party, eventually take control of Congress, and in turn, control the United States. And I know all of this sounds completely insane, but they have expressed their intentions very clearly on camera.
We're going to run hundreds of candidates, and we're going to primary all of the establishment Democrats. So we're not going to be like, is it Chuck Schumer? Maybe yes, maybe no, right? No, it's a hard no. But wait a minute now. Are you really going to primary vulnerable Democrats? Yeah, that's the whole point. If in 2018 we don't achieve our grand vision of a wholesale change in 2 years, which is very, very hard, we know that, right? Are you kidding me? If you got 6, let alone 12, let alone 24 people in Congress, you know what would happen in Washington? People would freak the hell out. They'd be like, oh my God, what in the world? These guys that had no money to begin with, no nothing to begin with, just put 24 people in Congress. Look, we want hundreds. We want to replace Congress.
In an article in Politico, one journalist wrote, "The group's criteria for picking primary targets is unclear and at times contradictory." Yeah, that's because their goal is not ideological. Their goal is control and power.
Washington doesn't care about beseeching. That's not how it works. They care about power. So primaries are an exercise in power. It's way past time that progressives exercise their power in this country, and that's exactly what these guys are doing.
Waleed Shahid, communications director for the Justice Democrats, has said, "You can tacitly support Medicare for All and the Green New Deal, and we still might primary you because there's enough energy in the district to find somebody more charismatic and compelling who is actually going to be a movement builder." No, you know why they might primary you? Because they don't own you. And maybe they found somebody that they think can beat you and that they can control, another AOC. Even Ilhan Omar has said it's quite inappropriate for groups to decide on whether or not somebody deserves to represent their district. Those decisions need to come from the people that we represent. And Ilhan Omar was actually endorsed by the Justice Democrats after she won her primary. The reason more people aren't speaking out against this completely unethical political tactic is that nobody knows it's happening. You might be asking, if all these guys are so corrupt, if what they're doing is so obviously sinister, why hasn't anybody else reported on it? Their tactics have been extremely different to anything seen in the US before, and that's probably why nobody has copped on to what they're doing yet. Also, mostly what they're doing is annoying Democrats, so conservatives haven't paid all that much attention. The first thing the Justice Democrats did was to try to primary Democratic incumbents, What that means is they would mount primary campaigns against incumbent Democrats, establishment Democrats already in Congress that they didn't like. This, as far as I can tell, was Cenk Uyghur's idea. Basically, the concept was, since many establishment Democrats weren't progressive enough, i.e. socialist, the Justice Democrats would nominate their own candidates to mount a primary challenge. One of the guys they didn't like was Joe Crowley, the guy that they put AOC up against. He had been in Congress for 20 years. Other members of Congress have reached out to AOC to try to convince her to stop primarying establishment candidates, but they're reaching out to the wrong person. AOC does not control the show. They should be trying to convince Saikat Chakrabarti. He's the one AOC takes her orders from. But Cenk and Saikat's plan is not to win a couple of congressional seats. It's total congressional domination.
Look, we want hundreds. We want to replace Congress.
Basically, Cenk's plan in creating the Justice Democrats was to replace all the Democrats in Congress with his own people. Radical leftists, socialists, people who would fall in line with his ideology. And he did it. He actually did it. Now, Cenk comes up with a clever quip from time to time, and he's been able to create a very successful propaganda platform with the Young Turks. But if you've ever watched him, you know he's not exactly a genius. He talks and acts more like a two-bit thug than a political pundit. So how did he do it? He hired geniuses. He brought in the top guys from the Bernie campaign. The Bernie campaign was unprecedented in their grassroots success. They were brilliant. I actually did a lot of research on this, and the keys to their success are equal parts nefarious and creepy, but they are, nevertheless, very effective. And you gotta hand it to Cenk. Bringing these guys on was a brilliant move. Fresh from the Bernie campaign with nothing to do, they must have been itching to tackle a new left-wing political project. So Cenk had this crazy idea. Replace all the Democrats in Congress with his own hand-picked radical left socialists. And he had a brilliant idea. Get the geniuses from the Bernie campaign to do it for him. And they did it. They succeeded. Perhaps not as well as they wanted, but it did work. And that is terrifying. Of the guys that Cenk brought in from the Bernie campaign, the two most important, from what I could find, were Saikat Chakrabarti and Zach Exley. Saikat seems to be the philosophical core of the operation, and Zach Exley is the organizational mastermind. Zach Exley is basically an expert on Saul Alinsky-style community organizing, and both he and Saikat are tech guys. They're very experienced with social media campaigning. Now, they did a great job in 2018, but make no mistake, these guys are not content with their 2018 victory. They're playing a long game here. 2018 was just the beginning. They'll redouble their efforts in 2020, 2022, 2024, at which time I am 100% convinced that they will run somebody for president. For the 2018 elections, the Justice Democrats endorsed 79 candidates. 26 of them won their primary elections. 7 of them won in the general election and are now in Congress. Most of these people's names I can't even pronounce. Raul Grijalva, Ro Khanna, Ayan Presley, Pramila Jayapal, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Of these 7, 3 were chosen through the audition process and are, as far as I can tell, puppets of the Justice Democrats, Saikat Chakrabarti, and Cenk Uyghur. These candidates are Ayan Presley, Rashida Tlaib, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Imagine if they run not 79 candidates, but 200 or 400 or 1,000. At their current rate of success, they would get 88 House seats, and if they improve their techniques, they might get more, including Senate seats. The first screenplay I ever wrote, I was 15, it was about a future in which a megalomaniac was trying to take over the US government. He was trying to do this by installing puppet politicians throughout the US Congress, giving him a majority, and in the climactic point in the movie, his puppet president is also elected. So in my screenplay, this villain effectively gains control over the US government through these politicians who are loyal to him. I never thought that this fiction that I wrote as a teenager would ever become reality. It's completely crazy, but it looks like this has actually started to happen. Cenk Uyghur is no longer formally associated with the Justice Democrats or AOC's congressional team, but whether or not he still holds influence over these people is unknown. What is known is that these people are dangerous. Zach Exley is a radical left Open Borders guy who was once a fellow at the Open Borders Foundation, which is George Soros' organization, and he seems to be the least extreme of these guys. Cenk Uygur calls his organization the Young Turks. The Young Turks is named after a group of Turkish revolutionaries formed in 1911 who slaughtered 1.5 million people in the Armenian genocide. So we know where Cenk's influence is at. Saikat Chakrabarti is influenced by this guy, Subhas Chandra Bose. How do we know this? Because he wears this Che Guevara-style shirt with Subhas Chandra Bose's face on it in most of his videos. That seems like a pretty deliberate choice. At first, I actually thought it was his own face. I was like, why is this guy wearing a shirt with his own face on it? That's crazy narcissistic. But then I figured out it was this Subhas guy. So who is Subhas Chandra Bose? He was the violent complement to the non-violent Mahatma Gandhi. Yes, the legendary Gandhi. Whilst Gandhi was trying to expel the British from India non-violently, this guy was like, no, let's start a war and let's kill them all. Actually, it was worse than that. Much, much, much worse. Subhas called himself a socialist, but he is quoted as saying, "Our philosophy should be a synthesis between Nazism and communism." Another important thing that we need to recognize about Subhas is that he was an anti-colonialist. Now, we're not super familiar with this political perspective here in the US, but in India, anti-colonialism causes deep resentment to this day.
Okay, I'm sorry I had a little bit of dead air there. They say, oh boy, that's a mortal sin in radio. But anyway, isn't that quite interesting? The brains behind OAC, and we've talked about how she was selected basically just as an actress, right? Just as an actress. So tomorrow, come back, and we're going to talk. I have some choice comments about this, and it wouldn't be hard to make the connection between the Young Turks and the Justice Democrats to our favorite people that go unsung, the heroes of the Jesuit order. Back tomorrow on the Investigative Journal.
The book of Revelation says, "The spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ." This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.